This was his baby. He felt he had been wronged by the NBA. This was what he was going to, as a great, well-known showman and promoter. This was what he was going to challenge the NBA and beat them at their own game. And it was sunk by this roguish owner in Cleveland who went behind his back and made a lot of promises about a merger and all of these things, and was underfinanced from the start and managed to get through on a smile and a shoe shine for a long time.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, as longtime comedian Marty Allen might say, hello there. And my name is Tim Hanlon, and this is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for joining us here on the big show. If this is your first time, we appreciate you giving us a try. If you're a repeat visitor or offender, as we might think, we welcome you back as well. Today is actually almost a quick responsive follow-up to an episode we had just a couple of weeks ago. We had Murray Nelson on the show a few weeks back talking about the origins of the short-lived American Basketball League of the early 1960s, and in particular, Abe Saperstein, the founder of that league, and his role in all of it. But today, we're going to be actually coming at it from a different angle by our friend and sports columnist for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Bill Livingston, who wrote a book a couple of years back called George Steinbrenner's Pipe Dream, the ABL Champion Cleveland Pipers. And as we mentioned with our chat with Murray Nelson, George Steinbrenner and his role in running and owning the Cleveland Pipers really was a very significant part of the ABL's short history. And a matter of fact, many would say that Mr. Steinbrenner, in his early days in running a sports franchise, soon to be fully in view when he owned and ran the New York Yankees, in many respects, kind of led to the demise of the ABL perhaps sooner than expected, and certainly not in the mind of Abe Saperstein, who had bigger ambitions. But the role of George Steinbrenner, the American Basketball League, and the shenanigans, you could argue, that brought about the collapse of the league and what was to come afterwards, is very much the set of conversation that we'll be having in just a couple of seconds with our friend Bill Livingston here on the show. A quick reminder that Audible, again, is our sponsor today, and we encourage you, please, to give us a try, give Audible a try, and get a free audiobook download and a free 30-day trial of Audible's audiobook service. Go to audibletrial.com/goodseats to get your free audiobook download, and there are over 180,000 titles to choose from, so there's no excuse to not try something. It doesn't have to be in sports history. It could be in, romance or comedy or sci-fi or business. Maybe you like a good thriller. I don't know, whatever you're into, just give it a try, right? Give the whole service a try. A free audiobook download. It's going to be a couple of hours worth your time. You're going to love it as much as I do. You can cancel at any time. It's audibletrial.com/goodseats to take advantage of that. And by the way, by doing so, you'll be giving a little love to our little podcast here. And we could always use a little love once in a while, your ratings, your reviews, but a little coin once in a while from some of our promotional partners, giving them a try, certainly encouraged as well. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial and your free audiobook download. I love Audible. You should love Audible. Let's all love Audible together, shall we? Okay. That's it for my promotional spiel, and I think now we should segue, shouldn't we? Yes, let's do so. Our conversation, our chat, our very interesting dialogue with Bill Livingston. We're going to talk about the ABL, George Steinbrenner, and the champion of that league, that one-year champion of the Cleveland Pipers, here on the podcast. I guess I'd love to kind of just get a sense of how you even got interested in the topic. Obviously, you've been a sports columnist with the Cleveland Plain Dealer for some time, but I suspect that the interest around this story didn't necessarily emanate from your day-to-day, or maybe it did.
No, I was approached about doing a book on it by a friend who had recommended me to his agent. And I had hoped to sell it to a New York publisher, And they actually liked it at one of the houses, but marketing decided that it didn't have enough of a Steinbrenner tag for New York, and they didn't think it would sell the 20,000 books that they're looking to sell nowadays, especially with a person who, I've written 2 books, but they were both basically local books. So I'd done a month's work of interviewing on it and some research, and I put it aside for a while. And my wife said, well, what are you going to do about the Pipers book? You really ought to look into trying to finish it. Maybe it'll lead to something else. And you'd said that it was a very interesting topic and a neglected part of sports history. And the more I thought about it, the more she was right. I realized she was right, which is not hardly the first time that's happened to me and her. And so I started doing it again. And it would have been a hell of a book 5 years ago before Larry Siegfried died and some of the other people died. But it's still a heck of a read because the story's just so amazing. It really, I just became, as I went through the microfilm of the Plain Dealer and the Cleveland Press and read the day-to-day coverage, the fact that it was Steinbrenner's first professional sports venture, but just the incredible ups and downs and twists and turns and the blustering lies he told to try to keep the franchise afloat, and that they almost got into the NBA on a shoestring and a bunch of promises by George.
Well, maybe we should back up a little bit and sort of get a sense of how George Steinbrenner, then the scion of a Cleveland industrial magnate, got involved in basketball in the first place, let alone this fledgling franchise and this fledgling league.
Okay, sure. He wasn't interested in taking over the Great Lakes shipping business. It was called Kinsman Shipping. It was basically the Steinbrenner business, though. And his father wanted him to become the head of the shipping. His father, Henry. They're all named Henry or George. It just goes, and the George Steinbrenner we know is George III, like the king. And, it was, I guess there will eventually maybe be a George IV, but you can't really plan on it like you did World Wars, but that's how it was. They were enumerated. And so George had been the Ohio Chamber of Commerce Man of the Year and was a wheeler and dealer in Cleveland and was always interested in sports. And he wanted to make his reputation in a different business than shipping. And the NIBL, which was the National Industrial Basketball League, had a Cleveland franchise, and it had the first black coach of a integrated team in professional sports basketball, certainly. John McClendon, who was from Tennessee State, was Tennessee A&I then, and had been a small college power with 3 straight NAIA championships. And there was a new league starting up. It all began with Abe Saperstein, the owner of the Harlem Globetrotters, who thought he had been promised the L.A. market by the NBA commissioner, Maurice Podoloff. And when the Minneapolis Lakers moved, Bob Short moved them and invaded that market. Saperstein felt he had been double-crossed, although he had already put out, as Murray Nelson pointed out in his book about the American Basketball League, he had already started putting out feelers to owners about starting a rival league. And this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and he then launched the ABL. And George was the front man and the chief owner of a group of 20 or so young guys in Cleveland, all the next generation of prominent families like the Stouffer Frozen Food Company, who invested in the pro basketball team. And his father was adamantly opposed to it and felt that it was foolish to be throwing money at a sports enterprise. So that's how it started.
So we talk with Murray, actually. It's our current episode that's out this week as we're recording it. So we got a little bit of sort of the Saperstein background on this, and it piqued my interest even further, obviously, with this particular part, because Steinbrenner obviously became, frankly, a pivotal person in the short history, and maybe the reason why it was a short history of the ABL. But before we go a little bit further there, maybe our audience could benefit from from the understanding that this idea of industrial basketball, right, was a real thing and a very solid thing, and
Sure.
albeit amateur, but not really fully amateur, right?
No, it was a mid-step. It was a midway step between college and the NBA. These guys were Bob Kurland, who had been a great player at Oklahoma A&M, now Oklahoma State, was with the Phillips 66ers. It was large companies that fielded company teams, and they had jobs with the company. Excuse me. And many players felt that they would have an off-season job, and it was also preparation for a business career. And there were some very good players who were in the NIBL, and at sometimes in the 40s, I think they had the Olympic team sometimes was composed of a lot of NIBL players. And in fact, when the Pipers were still an NIBL team, after the Pipers won the AAU championship, they went to the Soviet Union, the first American team to tour there, and it was mostly NIBL players, and many of them were Pipers. And John McClendon took them over because that was considered to be a big propaganda statement that America would have an African American coach leading this basketball team.
Sure. So give me some sense then of how Steinbrenner and his group of owners made the jump into, I guess, a fledgling professional league. I got the sense that it wasn't necessarily his idea alone. He might have been sort of coerced or maybe intrigued to jump into the professional ranks. He
was intrigued to make his own way and make his own name. And the team, it was very cheap. The team was called the Pipers because the first owner owned a plumbing company. It wasn't the little bagpiper with the tam o'shanter on his head. It was an industrial company, and they were flat broke. He got it for I think $25,000 or something and he certainly didn't put up all of it that he and his other investors put together. And he was not thrilled at having John McClendon as the coach because John McClendon was a soft-spoken guy. George was, by all accounts, not a racist at all, but he wanted a big name. He wanted to make a splash in the papers, and John McClendon was not going to do that for him, even though he was a racial pioneer in Cleveland, the city of racial pioneers, with Larry Doby and Frank Robinson, the first African-American manager, and Bill Willis and Marion Motley with the Browns, and Lenny Wilkins for that matter, and Wayne Embry, the first African-American front office really in the NBA. But George took over the team, and it was a few weeks before he decided that he would keep McClendon as his coach. And when he took over the team, they went to the AAU tournament. And even though they had the best record, the tournament was played in Denver because the attendance would be better. And they won a couple of games and got to the finals. And George wanted to bring them home because the hotel bills were running too high, even though they were sleeping to a room and not in the Ritz-Carlton, whatever that might have been of its day, the Brown Palace or something, I guess. And John McClendon had to go to a friendly banker in Detroit and Denver, and get a loan for the money that enabled them to stay for the final game, which they won. And they were the first Ohio team ever to win an AAU national championship. And after that, the team was a winning team, so he pretty much had to keep McClendon on as his coach as they went into this new venture, the ABL.
So what was the relationship between Steinbrenner and Saperstein, right? Because obviously Saperstein was the main engine, I guess, behind creating this new league. I mean, it seems like that Steinbrenner would have to be somewhat impressed or, convinced by somebody like Saperstein to say yes and to join in.
Well, to some extent, but George Steinbrenner pretty much went rogue early. He conducted business in his own way and quickly ran afoul of the league office. But the league was in such financial straits that there wasn't a whole lot they could do about him. They were almost expelled in midseason for not turning over the share of the gate receipts that they were supposed to give to the league, and for playing in they played all over the area. It was like the regionalization of the early ABA teams, like the Carolina Cougars. They played in Columbus, many suburbs of Cleveland, as far away as They as far away as Sandusky and Youngstown, and again in the 7-county metropolitan area, and at some high school gyms. And George kind of did his own deal with Saperstein. Saperstein apparently was a very weak and vacillating commissioner who he owned the Chicago Majors and ran them as a de facto Globetrotters farm team. He just shuffled players between the Globetrotters, whom he owned, and the Majors. If a Globetrotter looked good, he'd bring him up to the ABL team. In fact, they played at Chicago Stadium, not the NBA expansion team, because the Globies were such a big draw in those days. The NBA team, the Packers were originally the NBA team, followed by the Zephyrs and then the Bulls. Had to play at the International Theater, amphitheater out in the Stockyards area. And so, you know, he was pretty much a rogue owner all the way. There were all sorts of disputes that we can get into later about the league office and George.
Well, sure. So why were they so peripatetic in the Cleveland region? Was it because they couldn't find a place to play on a regular basis?
No, they did it everywhere, really. They wanted to try to, you know, popularize it around the area. But it was part of Saperstein's vision was to play games either at a league city or at a neutral site and play double headers. And they would also play series of games to cut down travel. So they, you know, there was a team in Hawaii. So you went to Hawaii one time, played 3 or 4 games out there. And teams very seldom won in Hawaii because of the travel, because of the, you know, attractions. And according to the late Mike Cleary, who was the first general manager of the Pipers and the first guy ever fired in pro sports by Steinbrenner, and later became the GM of the arch rival Kansas City Steers. It was because the referees were based out there; they didn't travel, and they were of Japanese descent. And he thought that if the Hawaii Chiefs didn't win, they might be on the next boat to Yokohama or something. But they had a tremendous home court record, the Hawaii team. You know, they played a lot of doubleheaders in Pittsburgh, which, you know, this was not a league. There are a lot of, you know, leagues that came and went and that are good, colorful stories. But the difference with the ABL, besides the 3-point shot, is that there were big names in the league. Connie Hawkins was he was the first LeBron. He was the MVP of the league at 19. After he had to leave the University of Iowa, probably innocent of point shaving charges. And there were Bill Spivey, who had been caught up in the Kentucky scandal, was played in the league eventually with Hawaii. And there was Tony Jackson played in the league and made 12 3-pointers in 1961-62 in one game, which would be the record in the NBA. And it was 25-foot shot, which was 1 foot 3 inches deeper than it is in the NBA. So, and actually, a thing that I did that I researched, the first full and the only full year of the ABL, they shot the 3-pointer a deeper 3 than the NBA one, and as deep as the ABA one, at a higher success rate than the NBA or ABA did in their first years.
That's amazing. What about to Cleveland for a second, though? Why, though, within Cleveland did they play in so many arenas?
Well, they had arena availability problems. They wanted to play at the Cleveland Arena, and it was owned by the owner of the Barons, a international hockey league team, and they had first call on the place, and its nickname was the Ice House. So their backup was Civic Arena, Civic Hall, which that's not its name. I'm blanking out on it, but it's still Public Hall. It's not really a very good basketball arena. It has a stage on it. It was originally used it was the site of a Republican National Convention. They had problems with it was difficult to get to the games, and basically they just wanted to try to take it and let people see the product also around the area. They played in Lorain and Ashtabula and a lot of the suburban areas. and Columbus. There was some thought that they were going to move the team to Columbus for a while, because George had a lot of Ohio State ties, and they didn't draw very well in Columbus either.
Well, that had to play havoc, though, with drawing people on a consistent basis to see the games, right? Because they didn't know where the stadium was. They're going to play the game. No?
Not only did they not know where the stadium was, or who sometimes they didn't know who they were playing. A controversy arose later in the season where they were supposed to be playing, I think it was the San Francisco team, the Saints, and instead they wound up playing maybe they were supposed to be playing the Majors, and there was a doubleheader, and they played the other team at the doubleheader because San Francisco, we heard, couldn't get there. With the papers first reported that San Francisco couldn't get there because of bad weather. Well, what it turned out later was George was refusing to go to the West Coast because he was hemorrhaging money, and he wanted to cut out the costly trips to the West Coast. And L.A. had already folded, the Los Angeles Jets, which was originally coached by Bill Sharman. San Francisco said, then we're not going to go to the Midwest, and they just didn't come. This is the type of rebellion that was going on in the league. The schedule was just a fluid thing that Saperstein made up on the fly. It was not an uncommon thing for the schedule that was listed in the paper that morning to be wrong.
That's interesting. So let's bring it back to Cleveland then and Steinbrenner, right? So is he trying to basically take advantage of this craziness and lack of stability and to his advantage already, or is this is a pattern?
He was just trying to stay afloat.
Okay.
His father wouldn't let him touch the family money, and he was just promising things and borrowing money and just trying to get the league going. And his goal was always to get out of this, as he called it, a bush league near the end of the season and get into the NBA. And of course, I don't know how many listeners know this, but they signed Jerry Lucas out of Ohio State, who was the kind of the Larry Bird and Bill Bradley of his day, the greatest white player in the game and the greatest scholar athlete in the game. And it was just stunning for this fly-by-night league that didn't draw anybody to get the most popular player on the most publicized team in the country. And that's how they got their NBA invitation that never came across because they couldn't pay the indemnity payments. But all along, he was looking for a bigger stage, and that's why he wanted a bigger name coach.
Well, okay, so let's unpack that for a second because, in the middle of that first season, right, the shades of what was to become a very obvious and renegade George Steinbrenner certainly started to show through, right, because he ultimately did indeed figure out a way to create or engender a rift with Coach McClendon to the point where,
right,
depending on who you ask, McClendon either quit or was fired and replaced, right? So what's the story there? It's clear that besides hemorrhaging money and trying to watch the pennies, Steinbrenner was still starting to show meddling interest, I guess, in making sure the team worked.
Yeah, he traded a player at halftime to the team they were playing that night. He traded Grady McCollum, a sub, to the Hawaii Chiefs whom they were playing that night in Cleveland, and wanted him to suit up and play against his teammates in the second half. And a tearful McCollum told John McClendon that, and McClendon was outraged, said, "You don't have to do that. Just go sit in the stands. You're not going to have to do anything like that." They had a first half playoff and a second half playoff, a split season, starting again after the first half playoff. The Pipers had 2 of the 3 games at home and managed to lose in 3 games to Kansas City, losing the 3rd game at home. And George went ballistic, and as part of it was his peak and just petty anger at the team that they had not won the championship of the first half, and the winner of the first half automatically went to the finals. That was the format. And part of it was he didn't have the money. He refused to pay the players, and this eventually leaked out to Bob Sudik of the press who covered them. And the players were going to boycott. They weren't going to go to a game in Pittsburgh if he didn't pay them because several of them were married and had children, or certainly had significant others living with them, or even though they didn't have children, they were married, and they had bills to meet. And there was almost a boycott of the, and Steinbrenner eventually gave in and paid them with a lot of recriminations about that.
So that sort of infamous mid-game trade, and then the reaction of McClendon of that trade, that was all predicated from or around losing that first half season series.
Right. And George also was a guy who, he was didn't want to be loved. He wanted to be feared and respected. And there was a game where the Pipers were playing in Pittsburgh, and they were saving money. It was a 2-hour drive. They were in station wagons, and one of them had a flat tire, and Coach McClendon stayed with the stricken vehicle and sent the starters on in the other one. And by the time they got it fixed and got to the arena, it was the second half. And he had told Jack Adams, who was his point guard, you're the player coach until I get there. And when he got there, they were solidly ahead, and they wound up winning the game by about 20 points. So McClendon just sat on the bench and let Adams continue to coach. And Steinbrenner went crazy about that and said, "What am I coaching you for? What am I paying you for if you're not going to coach?" He said, we won the game. I didn't have to do anything. We have a good team, and we were winning the game. So McClendon was a guy who, as someone said, who was with the Pittsburgh Wrens, that was a marriage made in hell. It was never going to work between a laid back, diffident, and yet, a core of steel about his personal dignity, like John McClendon, and a bombastic, temperamental, explosive person like George Steinbrenner.
Yeah, but by all accounts, McClendon was a well-regarded, almost revered figure, right? I mean, he was largely responsible for
he
recruiting.
wasn't the big name that George wanted. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
His faculty advisor at the University of Kansas was Naismith, was James Naismith. He had wanted to go to Springfield College, where Naismith had, of course, invented basketball. And his father said, "Well, he's on the faculty at the University of Kansas, and the family they grew up, I think, in the Kansas City area." He said, "Why don't you go to Kansas?" And McClendon was his faculty advisor was James Naismith. I mean, it's an incredible thing what history you were seeing with John McClendon, a man who actually knew and was given personal basketball tutelage by Naismith.
Well, and ultimately a basketball Hall of Famer. I think he was, in fact, inducted twice. I don't know the circumstances, as well as the college basketball Hall of Fame, right?
Finally in as a coach also.
Oh, there he is, a coach.
And that was long overdue because the Tennessee State teams won 3 straight NAIAs, and they were probably as good as the top NCAA teams of the era.
And McClendon was responsible for among other things, bringing in Dick Barnett, right, who was quite the phenom.
Sure.
Right?
Well, he brought a lot of his Tennessee State players in, and Barnett was the best one he ever coached. And Barnett was backed up, wasn't getting playing time in Syracuse. And, he was an African-American man in Syracuse in the late 50s and early 60s. It wasn't a whole lot of social life. And certainly not the type of social life you could get on the north side of Nashville at Tennessee State. And he left and came to the Pipers, and there was a lawsuit about it. And the strategy of the lawsuit all the time was to just bleed the ABL owners. They would eventually make a monetary settlement. And, had the ABL owners had the pockets of the AFL owners, there well might have been a first merger and not wait until the ABA, but they did. They weren't well financed enough to withstand the court costs that were thrown at them.
So is it fair to say that most of the owners, despite maybe their stomachs being maybe larger than their eyes being larger than their stomachs, or whatever the analogy is, wanted to effectively to challenge and then get into the NBA eventually?
Well, the top teams did. Certainly Kansas City wanted to, and Pittsburgh wanted to. Pittsburgh had Connie Hawkins. Kansas City had Bill Bridges, and the best team by far overall. They had the overall record. They were 9 or 10 games ahead of the Pipers on the season, and would have won both halves of the overall standings by a solid margin. But that was the league, the Jets folded early, the Los Angeles Jets. That was Sharman was the coach, and actually the player coach at first. it's interesting that he thought the 3-point line was too deep. It was too deep for him anyway. It just became the incredible shrinking league as Washington picked up and moved in the middle of the season to out on Comac, Long Island. Nobody could find it. It was a broken down old place. They played at Uline Arena, which was legendarily a terrible place in the NBA in the 40s when that was the host of the home court of the Washington franchise. And they played in it was in LA. They played at the Olympic, which didn't have room for a standard size court. It was something like 7 feet too short or 10 feet too short, something like that. So it was, it was a league that kind of like the early AFL teams that, remember Frank Ewell Field where the Raiders played, which was a high school stadium. That's kind of what some of the franchises are like in the ABL.
You wonder in the age of video that we live in today, if you had some footage of that. It's kind of hard to sort of frame even in my.
There's one small clip that I found, and it's the only proof that I ever found that the Pipers lived in. It's a shot of them in the small, tiny locker room after they won the fifth and final game of the end of season playoffs in Kansas City. It was played at a college gym because the municipal auditorium was being taken by the Ice Capades. And I'm pretty sure it's Barnett standing on a bench holding literally a steam pipe that was, running through the little locker room to steady himself and pouring champagne over a teammate's head. It's about 15 seconds long.
I got to find that. All right, so let's back up to McClendon. So let's clear up the McClendon story. So did he quit or was he fired or what? As far as you know.
He quit and then was given a face-saving job as a kind of a not a public relations man, kind of a community relations guy to go around and make speeches about basketball and about the Pipers. One of the real kind of sad stories I thought that happened was at that time, NFL players, nobody was worth the money that they're worth today. NFL teams had off-season basketball teams. And Jim Brown was a very good basketball player, along with a Hall of Famer, of course, in football and in lacrosse. And he was the big draw of the Browns off-season team. They were playing the Steelers in a game at the Cleveland Arena. And the usual thing would be if the Globies if the Globetrotters were the first game, half the attendance would leave after the Globetrotters game. They didn't rather than watch the ABL game. And the Browns, the NFL teams, football players playing basketball, had nearly the same effect. Well, when they're coming in, he's now got McClendon. He's got Sharman as his coach. He's got McClendon as a community affairs guy. He has McClendon coach the Browns team in a game where one of the Steelers wore a slouch hat during the game, and there was a lot of, not Globetrotter type antics, but there was a lot of razzing of the Steelers, and it was just kind of a sad thing to think of a man who had done as much as he had done, as John McClendon had done in basketball, and this great racial pioneer to be reduced to coaching in this kind of charade of a basketball game because he was still, Steinbrenner still could tell him what to do.
Well, okay. So with McClendon basically on the sidelines, figuratively and literally, why Bill Sharman of the now folded LA Jets? What was so magic about him, and why did Steinbrenner insist on getting him as the coach for the rest of the season?
Well, he was a big name, and George had heard good things about him. George didn't really know a whole lot about basketball. He was very excited to have signed Larry Siegfried. He was the only NCAA player of any note who came to the Pipers. And Siegfried was a defensive player. With Boston, he was a stopper in the backcourt stopper, not a flashy, flamboyant, high-scoring player at all. But he did know about Bill Sharman, and he knew Bill Sharman had a big name. George liked baseball. He had been a part-time baseball coach at Lackland at a Lockbourne Air Force Base in Columbus, where they played the Ohio State freshmen and got tattooed. And he knew a lot about baseball, and Sharman had also been with the Dodgers. I don't think he ever had an at-bat, but he was on the roster, called up in September. And so Steinbrenner, he became available, and, somehow Bill moved over here and put in a lot of the things that became standard in the NBA, the game day shoot around, and he was a big proponent of conditioning and visualization of success, and he was way ahead of his time in those ways. And made some lineup changes, and they were 2-7 in the second half when he took over, and they wound up winning the whole thing. So it was the right move to make, possibly just because he had so much big name credibility, and from his playing career too. George respected that compared to McClendon, George left him alone. I mean, he didn't second guess him as much. He didn't barge into the locker room at halftime. It was a much more sedate operation with a guy like Sharman running the show as coach.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download, but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. Yeah, it's interesting because I looked too at the stats, right, at the actual ABA finals, the actual final series, and it wasn't necessarily a clear shot there either, because Cleveland lost the first two games to Kansas City in that series.
Lost them big. It reminded me of the Cavs comeback against the Warriors last year when they lost the first two games by 48 points combined. They lost big, and they won two buzzer beaters here. They won on a Dick Barnett hook shot at the buzzer, and on a Connie Durking jump shot. Or no, Durking was a hook shot, and they called Barnett's a hook shot, but I'm told that it was his usual kind of, contorted fallback jumper deep from the corner. It might have been a three-pointer nowadays. I guess it wasn't, because they did have the corner three. I guess it was just a deep two. But and they went back out there after. That's a whole story too. They almost forfeited the final game of the ABL finals. We can get into that later on, or I can talk about it now.
Yeah, let's set the tone. So just to put this in context for our audience, I mean, I'm looking at the stats here. The first finals that the Steers of Kansas City and Cleveland Pipers played, I mean, it was basically every other day from April 1st all the way to April 9th. So basically 1 day break, and Kansas City pasted Cleveland by 25 in the first game on April 1st, 1962. And it looks like they won, Kansas City did by, 20, 30,
well, the Cavs had also,
points.
The Pipers had also had to survive a sudden death tournament to get to the ABL finals. Every team that was, there were 7 teams left, and 6 of them went into a series of sudden death games. And the Pipers had to win 2 of them. They beat San Francisco, against whom they did not have a very good record, and then they beat, I think it was New York in the second game, and had to play like the next night at the start of the finals. And they could not get into the arena, the Municipal Auditorium in Kansas City, so they played at Mason Halpin Fieldhouse. It's on a small college campus, Brockhurst College in the Chicago area, and in the Kansas City area. I'm sorry, and apparently there was no one there, including Steinbrenner, except Pipers players, McClendon and Sharman. Everyone else was Kansas City fans. But George, before they wanted to play in the game, George said that he had been told that he had been promised by Saperstein, and there's no proof of this, it's just his word, that the championship game would be played at the East Division's winner. Well, that's kind of spurious, because the East Division was not guaranteed a spot in the finals once this sudden death thing came up. I mean, it could have been San Francisco against Kansas City, and there is no East Division team. And Kansas City, rightfully, I think, said, well, you had 2 of the 3 games in the first half playoff at your place. We have the best record. It's only right that we have home court. And Steinbrenner said that they then would not go, that they would forfeit the game. He said, and Kansas City had booked flights for them, seats on a flight to Kansas City, and the Pipers canceled them. And there was no game the day that it was scheduled. And Saperstein finally belatedly got involved, and this was considered proof of what a weak commissioner he was. He finally sent a telegram and said he settled the dispute in the traditional sporting gesture of flipping a coin, and Kansas City had won, so the game would be played in Kansas City. And George left it up to the players, who, of course, wanted to play. And at one time, Saperstein also offered a co-championship. Kansas City and the Steers and the Pipers could be co-champions, and both teams indignantly turned that down. Certainly Kansas City did, because they were ahead at the time 2-1. So they wound up playing the game out in Kansas City with a place that seats about 3,000, and I guess it was 3,000 or so was the attendance, and apparently it was close to 1,000 over what everyone reasonably thought the capacity could be, almost all for the Steers. And the Pipers won 106-102. So they won 2 buzzer beaters in a close game, and were champions.
Well, so to Steinbrenner's delight, right, an actual championship. But it didn't seem like that was long-lived, because, pretty soon thereafter, or was it before they're winning the championship, that the whole machinations with Jerry Lucas and the eye on the NBA sort of?
Well, at first they were almost expelled. There was the expulsion meeting about not meeting with the not having reported the gate, and not having turned over the league share of the gate, not playing in big enough arenas, not wanting to go to the West Coast, openly flirting with the NBA, which it turns out a lot of teams did. I mean, in Julius Erving's biography, he says, I found out the Nets had been negotiating with the NBA all along. I didn't even know it was legal to talk to the other league if you were in the ABA. Well, the Pipers were doing that long before then. But they, after they won, he knew that they were not going to succeed in this league that was really crumbling before everyone's eyes. And he said, we're putting all of our eggs in one basket. We're going to try to sign Jerry Lucas. And everyone laughed. And he said, if we sign Lucas, we can play in a church league and sell out the house.
How did Steinbrenner convince Lucas to make a bolt, I guess, for not even an ABL game or team, right? How did he convince him to do it?
Well, no, at the time they were still going to play another ABL season, but the goal was always to try to get an NBA invitation and just jilt the ABL. Well, he was very canny about it. Lucas had said all along, many, many times, that he was not going to play pro basketball, that he didn't want to live his life in out of a suitcase, that, he was a Phi Beta Kappa, in the School of Commerce. Those aren't the Greek letters. There's some other ones for commerce, but the equivalent of Phi Beta Kappa. Extremely bright guy, very serious young man, a great representative at the Olympics. The most popular guy, would be mobbed by fans in Rome after games in 1960. And he had been on that NIBL team that McClendon coached in Soviet Union. As a couple of collegians were there, and Lucas was the big name. Lucas, they got him by Cincinnati offered him 3 years for $100,000, and Steinbrenner just snorted at that and said, "You won't get this guy. You won't get this boy with money." And what they did was they offered him a portfolio of stock options, which turned out to be worthless, a position in the future with the shipbuilding company or with other businesses that they would connect him with in Cleveland. And basically, they pitched a business career to him and life after basketball. And it was only for 2 years, not 3 years, that they signed him. And then he could, assess how he liked it. And they had also promised him that it would be a shorter season because he was already troubled by his knees. And that's how they got him. It was what he was looking for. They showed him that they had lost $125,000 in 1962 money, and he wasn't fazed and took their offer.
And what happened as a result of that? Can you give our listeners a sense of what kind of ripples that caused?
Like a bombshell. I mean, Lucas had played golf with the Cincinnati Royals, who had his NBA rights, the day before, and didn't say anything to them that he was meeting with the Pipers the next day to sign. Didn't give them any indication whatsoever. And the general manager of the Royals said it was like Pearl Harbor. Here he is smiling at us, and we're getting bombed. The next day we find we're getting bombed. And he said, "I don't think Lucas is the All-American boy he presents himself to be." And Lucas was the kind of guy who kind of told people what they wanted to hear. He discerned what their expectations were and was willing to string them along to some extent. And George was considered, Steinbrenner was considered just the magic man in Cleveland. I mean, he had been mercilessly and fairly ripped for the way he behaved as owner, and now he was the toast of the town. And there was a big piece by Arthur Daly in the New York Times talking about this miracle that the only reason that they got into the NBA, and it was by a 6-3 vote, which was the minimum. You had to have a 2/3 approval. They needed a 10th team to balance the schedule because one team was always idle. And they squeaked in the vote, and it was solely because of Lucas. The box office appeal of this in a sport that was becoming more and more black, this white player, the great white hope out of Ohio State, the Buckeye boy from a small town, middle town between Dayton and Cincinnati, who had led the Buckeyes to 3 championship games and 1 national championship, and probably would have won another one, except he was hurt in the 3rd one. It was again, it was kind of like a World Football League team or something signing O.J. Simpson or something right out of college. It was just nobody could believe it.
All this stuff repeats itself as another theme we sort of see in this podcast as we go on in the weeks and months ahead. This seems like it's history repeating itself over and over and over again. So all right, so back up though. I'm still fuzzy on. So Lucas gets signed, and the intention is to play in the ABL, or they decide not to. And
that's what they were saying publicly. Okay. That's what they were saying publicly.
But what was going on behind the scenes then?
Yeah, and then the George said that that Saperstein had given him carte blanche. That was the term he used, to negotiate basically for a merger with the NBA. And Murray Nelson's book says that Saperstein said that Saperstein said Saperstein had the carte blanche. But that quote appears in the Plain Dealer in contemporaneous coverage, with Steinbrenner asserting that he had, after the offer came out, that he had been given carte blanche by Saperstein to negotiate mainly for the Pipers, but also with the view of a wider merger. And I think it was 6 weeks or something like that before they after they got Lucas that they were invited into the NBA by the 6-3 vote.
So Saperstein must have been devastated and then angered.
Oh, he went crazy. He was in Japan or something. And people knew that the NBA people knew that he was a very litigious guy. And he sent telegrams warning that there would be legal action. And he came back and got the other ABL owners to commit to having another season. And he was fully prepared to sue their pants off, and the NBA, again, this wasn't the burgeoning sport of pro football that was just rocketing past baseball in those years, or starting to move past baseball, certainly with Unitas and the sudden death overtime game and all of that. This was not the new American craze. It was still just basketball, which was nothing like it is now. Ohio State was the most popular team probably in the country, counting pros, and they were not on TV until March. Was their first televised game for an undefeated team. Their Lucas's junior year. It's just unimaginable now. When they won the national championship, when Lucas was a sophomore, they got back at the Cow Palace. They got back into San Francisco at their hotel, and there was nothing to eat at the hotel. They went out looking for some place where they could get something to eat, and they found a bar and grill that was about to close up. And Siegfried was the oldest player and the captain of the team and the leader. And he told the owner, he said, well, could you just let us in? Because we just won the national championship. And the owner said, of what? There was no Final Four telecast then or any, it was the Cavaliers had West and Robertson at a Black History Month thing about 15 years ago. And they both agreed. West said it, but Oscar totally agreed. West said, when we played in the NBA, it was a minor league that presented itself as a major league, but it was a minor league. And that's, the ABL was even bushier league.
That's all right. So they sign Lucas, the entreaty by the NBA occurs. They're basically accepted. And they get to do nothing for the season.
Well, because they couldn't meet the indemnity payments to the entrance fees and the payments to the Royals for infringing on the Ohio market, although it's 250 miles away down on the Ohio River and Cleveland's up on Lake Erie. Steinbrenner lied about that he had paid all along, and it came out the Royals said charged that they had missed all their payments, and they showed a bounced check that payment to a player that they're $3,000, and there wasn't enough money in the till for that. When Mike Cleary was the general manager, he said the bank where that cashed the checks was in the same building as their offices, and he said when those checks came up, he said I ran downstairs and I got my money because I knew there wasn't enough in that till for everybody. So. They had a meeting in New York at the Roosevelt Hotel, and on a 9-0 vote, the offer was rescinded on insufficient funds. And there was an attempt by some other groups in Cleveland to buy in or take over the franchise and try to save it, but George wasn't going to give it up, and he never could produce proof that he had the backing. So that was that's kind of the way it went.
Where did the Kansas City Steers come into this? Because there was some kind of merger effort. Was that sort of part of the game?
Yes. There was this was another thing that Steinbrenner did behind Saperstein's back, basically, and Cleary and a couple of one other source with the Wrens confirmed it, that there was a plan to take the best players from the Kansas City team and the Cleveland team, and kind of with Lucas, and that would have been an early super team. Lucas signed a contract only with the ABL, and when that became void with the Pipers when the Pipers folded, he was a free agent. He was the first actual free agent The NBA was throwing all kinds of money at him to get him to sign. But they just, I think it was going to be Bill Bridges was going to play there, and Bumper Tremolin was going to be part of the merger. And it's in the book. I can't remember. Those were Bridges was easily their best player. But this too was just too little too late.
So in essence, Steinbrenner boxed himself into a corner. He played the game, lost it with the NBA, obviously had already backed out and was certainly not going to go back to the ABL. So that's pretty much kind of ended his pursuit then, I guess, right?
Right. He had tried to enlist the San Francisco Saints owner, and this guy kind of played him along and then backed out at the last second. And that was kind of really the death knell that he just wasn't going to be able to turn up the money after that. But he tried to, he did the right thing by his investors. He took an entire ore ship and turned the profits for however many months it took to repay their money. He took the profits from that and repaid all of his investors, which restored his good name in business circles in the city of Cleveland anyway. And there's a story, a guy that, Tony Tomczyk, who was the guy that Albert Bell threw the baseball at, the Sports Illustrated photographer, in 1995, fired a ball from the outfield at him when he was taking long-range shots of him for a cover story. Tony had been signed by Steinbrenner to do glossies for the team before the season opened, and the Berlin Wall went up, and Tony was in the Army Reserve, was called back to active duty. And he never got paid. He was promised $250, and when he was discharged, he came back and blew right past the secretary, marched into George's office, and started reading him the riot act and saying, "I was serving my country, and you can't pay me the crummy $250 you promised me. You ought to be ashamed of yourself." And Steinbrenner said, "The check is in the mail." And he said, "That's what you always say." And he stormed out. And he said later that week he got a check he got a letter in the mail from Steinbrenner, and he opened it up, and it was for $500, double what he had promised him. George always did these type of things. Apparently, he did terrible, thoughtless, impulsive things to people and tried to throw money at them to fix it. He had some, he certainly was not an amoral man with no conscience. He did have second thoughts.
And I guess so how did this play out against the schedule of the ABL? So when was this rescindment, if that's the word?
Well, now they were down to, first of all, back in the expulsion hearings, there was no way they were going to expel them because they were down to 7 teams then. You didn't want to have the league to continue to shrink. So they limped into the season, and the league folded on New Year's Eve, 1962. Yeah, 1962, and the Steers were proclaimed by Saperstein champions of the second season. In fact, I have seen the late Mike Cleary had a little ring that he said we probably got it for about $35 back then, which $35 back then was, I don't know how much, but it was a lot more than $35. But it had the University of Texas Longhorn head on the side, and it said ABL Champions 1962-63 Kansas City Steers, and they had gotten permission from the University of Texas to use the logo.
Interesting. So, but when during that ABL season did the Steinbrenner saga play out? Where was the ABL playing and this sort of played out, or
they didn't even. He was done by late August, and the league started up, and it was some funny stuff about the NBA knew that this league wasn't going to make it. Now, I mean, it was just they did crazy stuff, like there was a proposal to play 2 30-minute games instead of one 48-minute game, and they tried it one time and took a poll of fans afterwards, and nobody liked it, so they didn't do it again. But they were just trying everything to, they had a prize fight bell that would ring when anybody made a 3-point shot, because it was like the knockout shot or something, and they promoted it like it was a home run in baseball. There was a game in where Auerbach was there, and it was just like vultures coming over a a herd of cattle in the desert that were dying, and they were all scouting, and a fight broke out. And I'm trying to right now I can't think of the name of the player, but this player ran to the bench and wrapped his shooting hand in a couple of towels and went back and started punching people. It wasn't his first rodeo. He had done this before, but he didn't want to hurt his shooting hand because NBA scouts were there to see what, to evaluate talent, and maybe he would get a job.
So, okay. So at the end of all of this, and I'm still trying to get, and I couldn't sort of get this from Murray Nelson, and I still haven't really heard it from you. I'm wondering what the level of friction and or animosity might have been between Messrs. Saperstein and Steinbrenner, because I can't imagine it was nothing, given all this.
Oh, I think it was pronounced. It's just that the stories that I read, they're all dead. That I read didn't have anything from Saperstein about it. But this was his baby. He felt he had been wronged by the NBA. This was what he was going to, as a great, well-known showman and promoter. This was what he was going to challenge the NBA and beat them at their own game. And it was sunk by this roguish owner in Cleveland who went behind his back and made a lot of promises about a merger and all of these things, and was underfinanced from the start and managed to get through on a smile and a shoe shine for a long time.
Why do you think Steinbrenner ostensibly never went back to pro basketball again and moved on to things like the Yankees and other endeavors?
Well, I think baseball was probably his first love anyway. He had been an assistant football coach at Purdue and Northwestern also. I think basketball was just what came along in Cleveland as an opportunity. He told Sudik about a year after the team folded that he knew that he was never going to be a guy who would inspire love and affection, and players were going to play for him. They would play out of fear of him. And he felt the only way he could succeed was to, he said, everybody's got 10 more percent to give. No matter what you think, you've got 10 more percent that you can give. And he felt by goading them, and sometimes, he had, if they did well, he was, would give bonuses, which were probably illegal, or take the team out to dinner and things like that. But he felt that he could browbeat and intimidate and threaten to trade people even at halftime of games and squeeze the most out of them. He didn't want to be loved. He wanted to be feared and respected.
And how about Lucas after all of this? Did he have any hard feelings, or did he kind of presage this? And did he think this was going to happen?
Well, he signed a personal services contract with the Marks Advertising Agency, which had been one of the groups that tried to come in and kind of usurp the Pipers from Steinbrenner in his death throes. And he got paid regardless. It was one of these contracts like if the world ends, he gets paid the next day anyway. And he, after all the comments he had made, there was an excellent piece in the press that just listed all the comments Lucas had made about he would never play in Cincinnati because he was just reviled by the Cincinnati fans when he went to the ABL, and a columnist in Columbus criticized him for it, saying that if we'll never know how good he was because he chose to go to this Bush League, and we know he'll lead the league in points, rebounds, and checks cashed, and things such as that. Lucas, eventually wound up going back to Cincinnati, and it was almost like comments from the current president. One day it's black, and the next day it's white. Everything was sunshine and daffodils with the Royals now that he was going to play for them. He had no hard feelings towards Cincinnati and never meant to say anything detrimental about Cincinnati. It's remarkable. Jerry Lucas was a politician. He would tell you what you wanted to hear.
Okay, last question then. Legacy in Cleveland, to the extent that there is any. Obviously this league didn't last for very long, and this episode with the Pipers didn't last even as long as the league did. Was there any lasting legacy? Does anybody kind of really remember this aside from your writings and a few others? I mean, obviously the league itself had some legacies, like
the 3-point shot was huge. Yeah, I don't think anybody thought the three-pointer was going to revolutionize basketball to the extent that it has. It proved that a teenage guy could be a great success at some level of pro basketball with the Hawk. Proved, I guess, that there was most of the cities that were in the ABL, with the odd exception of Pittsburgh, wound up getting NBA franchises. Cleveland got one. There were others. San Francisco, the Warriors moved out there and became the San Francisco Warriors. They didn't have a Denver franchise, but several. There were Washington got one eventually. There were Kansas City. Kansas City got the Kansas City Kings. Rochester moved out there. A lot of those cities wound up getting NBA expansion teams down the road because I think they had shown that with a little better financing, that there was at least some sort of a market for it, and also the media markets, the television markets. For Cleveland was a top 10 television market then, and it's still in the top 20, I think. Really, I think there's not all that much, although at the first chapter of the book after the introduction is a quote from Barnett, who told me, I always say that we won a championship in Cleveland and LeBron James didn't, but nobody remembers the Pipers. Well, when the book came out, I signed a copy and gave that to LeBron after a practice and asked him to read this was before the 2015-16 season. And I asked him to read the italic precede before the first chapter. And he read it and started laughing. And I said, "You think you can make that obsolete?" And he said, "We're going to do our best." And that was the year they came back off the mat from 3-1 to the Warriors to win the championship. So
that's great. That's a great story. I do think, though, that there are some people out there that feel that the ABL was the true, inspiration, I guess, for the ABA later in the decade.
Oh, I think no question. I think no question about that. With the three-pointer and really, this might have been more Steinbrenner than a lot of people. The emphasis on colorful players and stars, getting Rick Barry to come over, and later on signing David Thompson out of college, and of course you had this phenomenon of Dr. J. That how did he ever wind up at a non-top school like UMass and play in the Boston market and still be a surprise to people, But they had him, and had been thrown out of Eastern Michigan for fighting and things like that. But I think publicizing individual players, the ABA really made its bones that way. But I think it kind of probably started with wanting Bill Sharman as a coach and trying to get Jerry Lucas as a magnet for the box office, and even getting Larry Siegfried before that.
Right, and Abe Saperstein being rebuffed by trying to get a franchise to move to the West Coast and expand into other markets, and again, it's another theme we see. We see with the football, we've seen it with certainly with baseball. We see it over and over and over again. Sort of these. There
were other players, that as I said, the stars make the league, and of course Connie Hawkins was the biggest name. But R.C. Owens played in that league. He only played 4 or 5 games. He was the roommate of Elgin Baylor at Idaho, and he played for an NIBL team that was an AAU champion before and he also, of course, the alley-oop pass came with him. Whitey Herzog was a referee in the league before he became a baseball manager. There's Merle Harmon was the voice of Kansas City. There were just a lot of people that became very famous for other things that passed through the ABL.
Very, very, very interesting. Well, that's another reason why we do these conversations, because it's some fascinating stories. And I do want to recommend to our listeners. Our guest has been Bill Livingston. He's been a longtime sports writer for the Cleveland Plain Dealer and other places, and a twice nominated Pulitzer Prize Award nominee.
I covered Dr. J in Philadelphia for 5 of the 6 years I was the beat man, and I've covered both tenures of LeBron James as a columnist here. I've been extremely lucky in my basketball writing.
Well, the book that Bill wrote, I think it came out a year and a half ago or so. It's called George Steinbrenner's Pipe Dream, the ABL Champion Cleveland Pipers. It's published by Kent State University Press. It is available wherever good books are sold, including you'll find a link to it on our website when the show goes up, of course. And Bill, this has been
Amazon too. You can get it on
Amazon. Again, wherever good books are found, indeed.
Yep.
Bill, this has been fantastic and fascinating. And I wonder if there are any other, I don't know, forgotten sports projects rattling around the back of your brain as well, or are you petered out?
Well, I did do this book. I wanted, I obviously wanted it to become a big success, but I honestly did have some real altruistic motives too. I think it's a very neglected part of basketball and history, both here and elsewhere, with surprisingly big names and surprisingly visionary rules. One other thing that they had the old international trapezoidal lane. They would have to use adhesive tape to put in the 3-point arc and the wider lane to prevent guys from camping out. They were a very visionary league in many ways. Just didn't have the money.
Well, Bill, thank you so much. This has been a tremendous story, and we appreciate your taking time to walk us through this story, and hopefully it'll pique some interest for folks maybe who didn't know the story or certainly haven't read your book, and we'll hopefully pick up a copy to do so.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Bill, it's been my pleasure. Thank you. Okay, there it is. There's our chat with Bill Livingston, all about George Steinbrenner, all about the ABL. Fun and frivolity to be had by all. What a time it must have been. And who could sort of understand sort of the psyche that is and was George Steinbrenner. It would have been interesting to talk to him while he was still with us to kind of get a sense of what he was thinking truly by getting involved with professional basketball via the ABL and what he had in mind for Cleveland and, his sights on the NBA, why he didn't go back and try to get an NBA franchise after all that stuff in the early 60s with the Pipers. Just fascinating stuff. And our thanks again to Bill Livingston, who, again, wrote the book George Steinbrenner's Pipe Dream, the ABL Champion Cleveland Pipers, is available for purchase. It's published by Kent State University Press. And wherever good books are found or sold, you can find it there. You can find a link to it on our website. If you just find the episode posted on goodseatsstillavailable.com, you'll find a link to the book there. And, of course, that is the website that you can keep abreast of what's going on with the show in general. Again, that's goodseatsstillavailable.com. Lots to do there. You can send us email, get on our email newsletter list someday when we publish it for the first time. All kinds of good stuff there. Follow us on social media. We love that, too. On Twitter, that's at goodseatsstill. You'll find us on Instagram at goodseatsstillavailable. You will find us on Facebook. There's a page devoted to the show there. And, I don't know. Find us on iTunes for sure and rate us and review us. We appreciate that immensely. That helps generate some heat for the show within the iTunes algorithm. That's not a bad thing either. Anyway, our thanks to not only our guest Bill Livingston, but to you for listening to us, and increasingly so as our rankings keep telling us. There's clearly a passionate audience for what we do here, and we can't thank you enough for supporting us and letting us know how you like the show. Until next time, take care, everybody, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.